You are riding into Bihar in the year 1193 under the command of a Turkic general named Bakhtiar Khalji, and by the account written down decades later, your target is a fortress, a walled position you believe is held by armed men. What your force actually rides into is a monastery, one of the largest centers of learning anywhere in the world at that time, home to thousands of students and teachers, and a library vast enough that later legend claims its manuscripts burned for days. The fortress turns out to have been almost entirely unarmed. Nearly everyone inside was a scholar. Nalanda had been growing for roughly 700 years by that point, founded under royal Gupta patronage around the 5th century CE, and expanding century after century into what many historians consider the closest thing the pre-modern world had to a great residential university. It wasn't a single building. By most accounts, it was a sprawling campus of monasteries, lecture halls, and libraries, housing thousands of resident students at its height. They traveled to it from Tibet, from China, from across Southeast Asia, drawn by a curriculum that went well beyond religious instruction into logic, medicine, grammar, and astronomy, taught by some of the most respected scholars of the age. A reputation serious enough that a journey to Nalanda was for a young monk from far outside India, something worth crossing mountains and deserts for. The account of how it met its violent end comes from a Persian chronicle called the Tabaqat-i-Nasiri, written by a historian named Minhaji Siraj. Not as an eyewitness, but decades after the events he's describing, compiling secondhand reports and court records into the official version of events that most later histories, and most of what gets repeated today, would end up relying on almost entirely. The story as it's usually told is simple and brutal, and it's easy to see why it spread the way it did. In 1193, Bakhtiar Khalji's forces sacked Nalanda, slaughtered the monks who couldn't flee in time, burned the library down to its foundations, and with that single raid, extinguished Buddhism in India for good in one afternoon, after 7 centuries of continuous scholarship. It's repeated in textbooks and documentaries and casual conversation and online arguments as settled, uncomplicated fact. One villain, one date, one ending. Everything before it building toward this moment and nothing after it worth mentioning. Here's the detail that complicates that certainty, and it comes from going back to what Minhaji Siraj's original text actually says. It doesn't name Nalanda. Not once. What he describes is the sacking of the fortress of Bihar, Hisari Bihar, which most historians now believe refers specifically to a different monastery, Odantapuri, not Nalanda itself. The identification of Nalanda as the site of that particular raid is a later historian's inference built from geography and context, not a direct claim in the primary source everyone traces this story back to. That doesn't mean Nalanda escaped violence during this period. The wider region was devastated, and other contemporary accounts describe monasteries destroyed and manuscripts thrown into the Ganges, but the single specific cinematic version, Khalji personally burning Nalanda's library, is less solidly sourced than its constant repetition suggests. What we do have is something almost nobody includes in the popular telling, a first-hand account of what Nalanda actually looked like more than 40 years later, written by someone who was actually standing there, not compiling second-hand reports from a court far away. In 1235, a Tibetan pilgrim monk named Dharmasvamin traveled to Nalanda expecting to find the legendary university he'd heard about his whole life, the place every serious student of Buddhist philosophy still measured themselves against. What he found was damaged, unmistakably but not dead. Of roughly 80 monastery buildings on the site, most stood abandoned, roofless, stripped, but 2 were still functioning as working monasteries. A 90-year-old abbot named Rahula Shribhadra was still teaching there, in person, supported financially by a local king named Buddhisena, instructing around 70 resident students, Dharmasvamin himself among them, studying grammar under a man old enough to remember a version of Nalanda that no longer existed anywhere else. Historians studying why Nalanda partially survived while other nearby monasteries were wiped out completely point to a few specific, almost mundane reasons, nothing dramatic about any of them. It had fewer stone structures worth stripping for building material elsewhere, which made it a less attractive target for later scavenging. It was simply too large physically to be destroyed completely in a single raid by a force passing through. And unlike some other monasteries in the region, it didn't sit directly on the main road connecting Delhi to Bengal, so finishing the job completely would have required someone to deliberately mount a second, dedicated expedition. And as far as the record shows, nobody did. So if one raid didn't end Buddhism in India, what did? The honest answer historians give is much less satisfying than a single villain, and it takes longer to explain than a single sentence. A slow, multi-causal decline stretching across centuries, not an afternoon. Royal patronage, which Buddhist monasteries depended on directly for land, for funding, for basic protection, shifted steadily toward resurgent Brahmanical Hindu institutions as ruling dynasties across the subcontinent changed hands over generations. Buddhist philosophy, and even the figure of the Buddha himself, were gradually absorbed into a revitalized Hindu tradition rather than simply defeated by it from outside. In several traditions that took shape over these centuries, the Buddha was incorporated as an avatar of Vishnu, folded into the very religious system some accounts describe him as having been erased by. The monastic economic model depended on land grants and elite sponsorship rather than a broad lay congregation, the way later Buddhist traditions elsewhere would develop, became harder and harder to sustain, as that sponsorship dried up region by region. The violence of the 1190s was real, severe, and genuinely traumatic for the specific institutions and people it hit directly. Nobody serious disputes that raids happened, that people died, that monasteries burned. But it landed on a religious and institutional structure that had already been weakening for generations before Bakhtiar Khalji's forces ever crossed into Bihar. Not a thriving, healthy tradition cut down without warning in a single afternoon. And here's what's worth noticing about why the simple version won anyway. A single dramatic villain and one clean date is just easier to hold in your head, and easier to grieve, than a 300-year withdrawal of royal patronage and gradual religious assimilation. History doesn't usually end that way. Stories prefer that it does. There's a 90-year-old man in this story, worth sitting with longer than the raid itself. 4 decades after the year everyone agrees was Nalanda's ending. In every textbook summary and every documentary that compresses this into a single dramatic scene, Rahula Shribhadra was still standing in its ruins, still teaching, still had 70 students who traveled real distances to learn from him, still had a king willing to pay for it out of his own resources. Nobody wrote his name into the version of the story that gets repeated at dinner tables and in comment sections. He doesn't fit it. An old teacher quietly persisting for decades, past the point where the popular narrative insists everything was already over, is a much stranger, much more human ending than a single burning library. It doesn't resolve as cleanly. It doesn't give you a villain to be angry at and then move on from. And it asks you to sit with the much harder fact that endings in history are rarely as tidy as the date printed underneath them. Maybe that's worth remembering whenever a whole civilization's ending gets compressed into one dramatic afternoon, in this story or in any other. Somewhere underneath almost every clean historical villain narrative, there's a longer, slower, less photogenic truth waiting in the actual primary sources, for anyone willing to go back and read what they actually say, instead of what everyone agrees they said. And often, if you look closely enough at the real record instead of the summary of it, there's someone who simply kept teaching anyway, long after the story had already decided he shouldn't have been able to.